Alex, let's move forward to this question of the Cold War and the peace that we had right after the Cold War, right? And things were getting better. I grew up in the 1990s in Switzerland, and things like nuclear annihilation, they were not on my mind or on anyone's mind anymore. And the Soviet Union was gone, and things were going well. The worst thing that happened that was going on was the Yugoslav wars, but it felt so far away and so distant that it took me into my 20s to realize that Yugoslavia was part of Europe. That's how removed it felt. Now, that period is over.
Yeah.
What's responsible for that?
Yes, it is the lost piece. And you're absolutely correct. Now, I actually did grow up through the Cold War. I remember the Cold War. I remember nuclear confrontation. I remember the great tensions that existed at that time. And I remember also the sense of enormous relief and euphoria that we had at the end of the 1980s and at the beginning of the 1990s, and the immense gratitude, by the way, and this is an important point to make, people felt to Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader who had played an instrumental role in bringing that all about. And the situation in Europe stabilized, and Russia opened up, and one found for the first time that we'd actually meet Russians, for example, which inconceivable in the Cold War era. I mean, I never, for the early part of my life, I assumed I would never actually meet a Russian. I mean, that was the kind of world that we lived in. And South Africa also changed. The apartheid system collapsed in South Africa at about the same time. And everything seemed to be coming right, and governments seemed to be working together, and people were meeting. What went wrong is very simple, and I think this is the heart of the problem. Some people in the United States did not see the events of the 1980s and the 1990s as a turn towards peace. What they saw it as, what they understood it to be, was a victory for the United States and for particular policies that it had followed. So they assumed that they'd come out of the Cold War winners, which is why, by the way, I mentioned Gorbachev, because it's important to understand that Gorbachev made certain very difficult and very important decisions and was supported by Russian society ultimately in making those decisions. In other words, the agency of people like Gorbachev and the agency of people like Russia and of other people was discounted. And in the neocons, the priority is not to achieve peace, it is to secure victory. It is a completely different outlook. And if you are seeking peace, then, of course, from their interpretation, that is appeasement. And that has disastrous effects. And the disaster that we are seeing in Ukraine today, which was completely avoidable and which would never have happened if people like Kissinger had remained in charge of the foreign policy of the United States. The disaster we're seeing in Ukraine today is precisely because it is the second group, the people who are the victors or who perceive themselves to be the victors of the Cold War, wrongly as it happens. Those people are in overall charge of US foreign policy. And in fact, they're becoming even more angry and belligerent and aggressive as they sense that the Russians won't accept that they lost the Cold War. And as they see this dominant position that the United States had achieved in the 1990s slip away. And that makes them even more forceful in their attempts to secure their victory, the victory that they imagined they achieved.
Now, this it's so disillusioning to me because I thought, this neutrality concept is one that has safeguarded peace several times through history. Switzerland, one of them, Austria, another one. We've got several examples. I mean, even Belgium, it worked for basically 80 years. That's a good amount of time where like a concept keeps a place safe, right? Now, now we're realizing the attacks on neutrality and non-alignment on basically the part of the world that doesn't want to use warfare is not coming from Russia or from China. It's come from the United States. Now, where does this leave that as like realists in international relations? Can this concept still add something in order to secure peace, or is it doomed? Where do you see it going?
It is absolutely vital if we're going to secure peace. Now, you mentioned Dmitry Trenin, who I also have an enormous respect for. And of course, this is the fundamental difference between Americans and Russians. And it goes back to your earlier point, because, of course, Americans have no experience of war on their territory and of defeat, military defeat. Of course, the Russians do. For them, war is something that they are incredibly familiar with, and which they understand very well what the consequences of being defeated can be. And Trenin and people like him expected that in the United States people would understand that. And I think they're baffled and deeply disillusioned and very unhappy and very angry, actually, because they didn't find that understanding in the United States. Now, the Russians, even during the Cold War, after the Second World War was ending, were looking to establish neutral positions in Europe. So, for example, Joseph Stalin, a man, most people would not perhaps have very much good to say for, but his policy after the end of the Second World War was a disarmed and neutral Germany.
Yes.
He wanted that stability in Europe that would both protect Russia's position, which had just been through a devastating war, and at the same time, as he saw it, would work in the interests of all parties. He led the Soviet Union through this terrible war. He didn't want to have the experience of a further one against a much more powerful country. His priority, in his own way, was to secure peace. And it was after he died, the Soviets managed to persuade the Western powers to agree that with Austria. And there was an understanding that, yes, we have by this point divided Europe into a situation where there are camps. But there was also an understanding that this shouldn't be spread right across the world. And you had this extraordinary ballast in the international system during the Cold War, which is the non-aligned movement, which is a kind of neutral movement that emerged from the Bandung Conference in 1955. And it was a major stabilizer and came to be understood more rapidly in the Soviet Union, but eventually even in the United States, that was an essential part of the global architecture. So neutrality absolutely has a place to play. If you prioritize peace, what you understand is that you need neutral states, you need neutrality, both for the benefit of those states and for the benefit ultimately of the great powers. Because if the great powers see one great power absorbing all the former neutral states and bringing them together into its alliance system or sphere of influence, then they will feel threatened. And that will mean that they are no longer secure in themselves, and that will undermine peace, and it will eventually lead to war, which is exactly what we have seen in Ukraine now.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. The issue that we have is, how do we trust them again? Because as much as I would say any Russian who ever believes, again, a promise that comes from the West would be ill-advised, because by now we've seen over 30 years, so many broken promises, so many on paper and not. The Russians broke their own promises too. They did so too. But the thing that we need to learn is you cannot trust these promises. So what you need is a system that stabilizes itself without relying too much on these pieces of paper. do you see a way that through which to do that? I mean, maybe with the logic that you outlined of having neutrals that need to be there in order to secure the others and tell them like, look, we're not actually expanding, just as NATO now did.
Yes, I mean, this is you put your finger on what is now by far the single and greatest problem, because one mustn't idealize the Russians, but the big initiatives to end the Cold War started with them, with Gorbachev,
Yes.
with people around him, and I mean they took the first critically important steps to end the Cold War, and they were given all kinds of assurances and promises, which it is increasingly clear now were never intended seriously. And of course, that is very embittering. And the way in which the Ukraine crisis has developed has been even more embittering for them. I mean, the